Hello, Melbourne. Hello, NENA Conference. This is John Thackara talking to you from my home in France. In many ways, I wish I could have been with you because I've heard from Darren quite extraordinary tales of the story so far. But as I said to him, the last time I was in Australia, I was in Perth, where we were discussing the phenomenon of FIFO, flying in and flying out. And we all agreed what a terrible thing it is that people from the mineral extraction industries in the north of Queensland should fly in for a week's work and then fly out again. And then halfway through this conversation, somebody said, "Hey, but wait a minute, John, haven't you flown into this meeting and aren't you going to fly out afterwards?" And so I think I have to walk the talk more. So therefore, I'm here and you're there. But from here, and what I've heard from Darren, it sounds like the key question that you've been grappling with amongst an extraordinary array of positive stories and signals of transformation is this picture of lots of good small things happening around the world and throughout Australia and your areas as well. But with the question, does this proliferation of small good things really do the job when confronted by the grimness of the big picture? Everything from climate change that we've heard about, the IPCC report, to the reappearance of Nazis and 101 small pathologies in between. What, in other words, is missing maybe is the politics of change and transformation. Is it questions for us is how do we actually grapple with the question of the political side of the story? So in this, my afterword for your discussion so far, I thought I would talk about how I think change happens, which is to say I don't have easy answers to this big political question, but for me, there are three conditions which need to be met if change is to be transformational rather than incremental green shoots. The first, the old system must be dying. Secondly, a new story needs to be emerging that connects the seeds of change that you've been discussing with the bigger picture in a transformational narrative. And thirdly, the third condition for transformational change is we need tools and platforms which make it easier for much larger numbers of people more easily to engage in the kind of work that we are all involved with. That is to say, some kind of social infrastructure to massify things that at the moment appear to be small and separated. So just to quickly run through those three conditions. One, the old system must be dying. Check. I don't propose to say any more about that. I think it's fairly obviously that we're in the end stages of an extractive and bio-ecocidal regime, but you've been talking about that. You don't need me to remind you of that. So straight on to number two, the emergence of a new story to make sense of what otherwise might be separated, small actions. A word before I go on to the positive stories, because I think there are two that I have personally struggled with for the best part of 25 years and don't really latch onto very hard. The first is this notion of degrowth as a sales point. It's been too hard to sell. I've tried for 25 years to persuade people that we need degrowth. Intellectually and confronted by evidence, not to mention miscellaneous bad news, people say, yes, that's probably true, but it's a negative, and it's a negative which doesn't seem to have any kind of traction with the kind of people that might be instrumental, from corporate leaders, politicians, experts of one kind or another. So it's not that degrowth is bad, it's just that it's not the story that connects things in a dynamic way. And then secondly, utopias and desired future states. Again, very fashionable at certain times in the environmental movement and change movements generally. But my own experience is that utopias and pleasant but not yet real futures are too easily co-opted by marketing, everything from hedge funds to the creative industries. The second a kind of plausible picture is put on the table or on the screen, somebody will then take it away and sell you something back in return. And I think that the very many people I get are very skeptical and not inspired and don't find meaningful utopian futures. But the story that does make sense and that does have traction for me is care for place. The notion that from the scale of the neighborhood in your city, if you're a city person, to the bioregion, if you're operating on that scale, there is a kind of potential that people, when asked the question, do you want your place to be healthy? Yes or no? It's hard to say no to that, particularly when I think it's becoming so obvious in so diverse contexts that the health of the place and the health of our bodies and our communities are basically the same story. So everybody wants their place to be healthy, and that notion of care for place provides the framework for getting people to start working and talking together who might otherwise have very divergent interests and ideologies. But that's a subject which I have my own experience in the last 5 to 10 years has been care for place has a resonance that all the other stories do not. And I have to say that care for place is, of course, political. It's not a kind of technical matter because it raises questions from everything from land tenure to the control of food systems. And that although it sounds and is a basis for starting to work with people from diverse backgrounds, care for place does raise issues that have to be resolved. I mean, think about food, for example. I mean, food systems, there's some amazing stories and expertise in that room. I know about the different ways to think about food systems and place-based nutrition. But the thing that has struck me, and I've been involved in a lot of food projects over the last decade or so, is that once one gets beyond the notion of food as a purely technical or managerial question of sustenance, it inevitably raises issues of social justice, of ecological regeneration, of the health and the reviving of regional economies, democratic engagement. So food is, obviously it's one of the most political subjects is. Food and place are inextricably linked. Therefore, I think that this is why we're not deviating or escaping or running away from politics when we look at care for place, care for the systems that keep that place alive, the systems that feed us and bring us air and water. They are all at the center of that story. Just as an example, I'm working in Italy, which is one of the homes of, actually, in many ways, sustainable food systems in diverse contexts. The biggest event that's happening there, apart from the general subject of solidarity and food sovereignty issues, is a project called Mamma Mia, in which the focus is on making visible and celebrating not the latest technical solution to food in particular places, but the role played by women of different generations and families in food culture. And everybody is saying, yes, please, can we discuss and celebrate the social aspects, the cultural meanings of food, the role of women in the food cultures of families and communities, rather than getting into these endless discussions about the technical concepts or the words that the policymakers fight about. And so therefore, I'm very excited by this Mamma Mia project as a next generation, along with notions of moving towards food as a commons. Food is very obviously a right, along with all the other basic rights that nobody can really disagree that food should be a right, but therefore it's a question of the practical arrangements for that. And then the third condition for system change is that the old system is dying, number one. Secondly, we need a story to frame something new. The third is that tools and platforms are needed that enable much larger numbers of people to get involved in these small, diverse projects, as again, that we've been discussing in your conference and in many other places. Another way to think of this is social infrastructure, the kind of frameworks and the platforms and the tools and the trainings that are needed so that people can engage who might otherwise feel it's too complicated, too alien, not for them. And I think that the three requirements for social infrastructure moving forward, and this is basically why I move into my rather practical to-do list of design and organizational tasks. Firstly, we need platforms and frameworks that make it easy to and very accessible to take part in the projects that we take part in as pioneers and activists, so that sharing and commenting need to be as easy as going to catch a bus or kind of making a phone call. Secondly, we need frameworks that enable us and encourage us to learn from other places and other times. I think a lot of people are put off participation in commoning activities or social innovation or these words because they see them as the place where fanatics and super activists and only the kind of most committed can reasonably survive. And when you look back in history and in other cultures around the world, which we're all beginning to do now, you think, well, they didn't have the need to be fanatically hardworking. They didn't have internets. They didn't have blockchains. They didn't have these tools and techniques that so enthuse us. But they seem to, for 10,000 years, work pretty well in simpler conditions. So what can we learn from the past? And then thirdly, we do need to reassure ourselves and reassure these new waves of people coming in that the tools and the activities, the projects that we're doing can be scaled out, multiplied, reproduced in different ways. I love this expression that Darren told me about this morning. Scaling out rather than scaling up answers the question about the necessity for context and the uniqueness of place to be at the center of it all. And I know that you've been talking about, in terms of tools that are out there now, there's so much happening, peer-to-peer of various kinds, platform cooperatives, and Spiral and Lumio, crypto, blockchain. The main thing that is an obstacle to these tools and platforms being, I think, embraced and used on a much wider scale is partly the train spotterish language with which the experts are in developing their expertise on this subject. But I actually think that the language and the translation and the usability is a perfect task for example, usability designers or service designers to say, if there is a tool out there that more people need to know about and to lose, that's a design opportunity. So I actually have given up hoping that nerds will stop speaking in nerd language, because nerds are very brilliant and necessary part of the picture, but they're not going to suddenly become people that they are not. But maybe designers who can be the translators and the connectors of those things. And a quick example of how, where there is a will, there's a way. And Lumio, which is grown and created in New Zealand, is now being used in a project in England called Our Field, which is, to me, a brilliant example of how things can take root when the opportunity is right, which is, I think, now. Our Field is part of what's called the cooperative grains movement. And a woman called Abby Rose was part of a community that said, how do we get better locally grown grains to put in the locally grown and handmade bread that we're also keen to have? It turned out that it's actually quite complicated and difficult growing heritage grains for bread, because for lots of reasons. So, and for farmers, it's just not really a viable opportunity on its own to say, okay, a few foodies want heritage grains, I'll drop everything and start doing that. So Our Field is a cooperative arrangement whereby 100, 200 citizens pay to be in a collaboration to help with the farmer in the growing of the field. And it's complicated. You look up the hashtag Our Field, you'll find the details. But the beauty is that this, and this project is filled with people walking around fields and meeting in barns and elderly farmers and, bags of wheat. Their chosen platform for discussing the project is Lumio. They found a tool that they needed for this very diverse group of people, some working on the land, but many in the city, to communicate with each other in a very good way, make decisions and so on. And that's been, just to me, a revelation of how the tools that we need to collaborate and share in new ways are there, and that we can then start looking at normal, non-kind of technically brilliant people, how they've adapted them for their own use. The second tool requirement or social innovation requirement that I mentioned is the importance of learning from other places and other times. I'm pretty passionate about this because there's so much obsessing about innovation as something which is inevitably future-oriented. For me, innovation is more powerfully looking back in time and looking to other cultures to see who has done this before. You've had this inspiring talk I've heard at your own conference about Indigenous elders who in Australia have cared for their land and ways that we might describe as common, but might not. It's for them to decide. For 50,000 years, we do not have to reinvent the concept of caring for land in a common way. I learned last week that there are 3,000 different words for sharing in African cultures. This is one that somebody has been able to count. And in Latin America, as some of you may know, there's an incredibly rich and diverse tradition of solidarity, different ways of collaborating to occupy land, to look after living systems, and so on. The work of Arturo Escobar, some of you may know if you're designers, the notion of planos vita, life plans. They have a living tradition of organizing communities and economies in a way that creates space for the land to flourish that they've done for generations. We don't have to reinvent that. And then finally, in terms of social infrastructure, Darren said, well, one of the big questions is how do we kind of get from small to big? And I think it's pretty important to cast our attention to the notion of existing institutions. Some people call them anchor institutions, everything from folk high schools to community colleges, public libraries, schools, local and regional museums, working men's clubs, Boy Scouts, Girl Guides, guilds, friendly society, the Elks, the Freemasons, the Oddfellows, pubs, post offices, local shops. I'm reading from my list of the incredible variety of assets in terms of places, organizations with history, organizations with buildings, organizations with networks that are all out there, and more or less everyone, even if institutionally they're not ready to embrace transformational change, for sure they include individuals who are looking like we are for a more radical change. And those resources, for me, are one of the key and most powerful ways to imagine multiplying our efforts in a way that we think is such a priority. In the same spirit, I think we have to be much more creative in reaching out to faith communities. All of the religions of the world, certainly since the COP summit, have been organizing in a very kind of methodical and extraordinary way meetings and congregations and teachings about how to meet the Pope's demand for a kind of taking care of the planet and taking care of biodiversity. I'm not an expert on this, but for the Catholic Church, for example, the Good Land Initiative is a kind of Catholic grassroots campaign around the world to say, well, we have all sorts of land in the church. Are we looking after it? And if not, what can we do to look after and steward our land better? Wherever you are, go and find out what your local faith communities are doing. So I said I would just do a quick 20 minutes to finish up. I think that this political question is a loaded one if you think that politics is about winning elections, but if you think that politics is about triggering and enabling and amplifying transformational change, I think the conditions are in place. We know the old system is dying. We know that a new story of care for place is emerging and has resonance and meaning for people in lots of different places. And above all, we have the tools and the platforms ready and waiting to be used when much larger numbers of people, as I think is happening now, we're at some kind of transformational tipping point. When they want to get involved, they have the ways to do it. We don't have to invent a whole pile of stuff from you. Thank you for your attention. You've been very good. You've had a long and very intense 3 days. I wish you every joy and success and super activity when you leave the conference and go back to your places. Thank you.